Why do people tend to disappoint us, usually right after we have just appreciated them? Let's talk about this in this video. Now, all right, let's get into today's episode now. I think this is going to be a really interesting one. It took me some real hard work and design to really come up with what I'm going to talk about in this episode, but I think it was all worth it. This is going to be a really interesting one. So, the topic that I've picked up for today's episode is one that even statisticians and mathematicians say it's kind of really hard for their students and also their peers to wrap their heads around. And that is something I'll touch upon at the very end of this episode. So, make sure you stick around. The topic is regression to the mean. Now, this might sound a bit of a mouthful and a bit more technical, but what it really boils down to is something that is kind of a fact of nature and something that is it's found in a lot of statistics and a lot of those data driven analysis that people do, but we're not going to go into those technical details. What I'll talk about in this episode is going to be absolutely real life applications of this beautiful yet a little complicated fact, let's say. So let's get into it. What do we mean by regression to the mean? I'm going to start with a little anecdote, like always, right? So this is the story of a professor who was visiting an army training camp, and he was giving a lecture to a bunch of folks, and he was explaining to them one of the things that he was talking about in his lecture was whether rewards for improved performance work better for training people better than punishments when they haven't been so good, let's say, right? And he says that in his entire lecture he was able to drive home the point, driven of course by a lot of data and a lot of studies that have been performed on humans, animals, birds, etc., driving the point that it is actually true that rewards for improved behavior and improved performance work much better in skill training as compared to their counterparts of punishing the person or the animal or the bird when they have not been so good, right? Now he says that he was able to drive home the point, but at the very end of his lecture, one of the senior officers stood up and he said, I appreciate your lecture, but what you said might have worked on animals and birds, but it definitely does not work on human beings. And this is something I know from experience because whenever I've appreciated a cadet, whenever I've appreciated a junior person, he or she has always disappointed me the next time. And whenever I've screamed into the ears of one of my cadets, they have worked hard to outperform everyone else in their batch, right? And the professor, our protagonist in this anecdote, he says that it was kind of a eureka moment for me. He did not fluster. He says it was a eureka moment for me because I was finally able to see a real life application of regression to the mean happening right in front of me. And also how it's most commonly convoluted into a causal story. What does he mean by that? He says that, a very easy way to understand it is that you can very well judge from the anecdote that I just described that the senior officer is not one who would give out appreciations very easily, right? So whenever he would have appreciated a cadet, he would have done that only when the cadet did something appreciation worthy according to him, right? Which would have his bar was quite high. And whenever a cadet would have performed so well that so as to deserve an appreciation from this guy, the luck would have played a massive role in his performance, right? And therefore, the next time that person goes on to perform a similar job, he or she is more likely to fail, more likely to come down to kind of a mediocre outcome. It's just a fact of nature. That's how your luck works. Your luck is not supposed to be with you every single time you go out to perform the same tasks or even similar tasks, right? And so in that sense, regression to the mean is kind of the fact that extreme outcomes, especially in situations where luck is involved, extreme outcomes are bound to be followed by let's say, mediocre outcomes, right? So, in the case of this anecdote, this guy, even if he would have not appreciated this person, that person's performance was bound to come down. And on the contrary, the person whom he screamed into the ears of, and that person would not have performed so good, you can assume up till the point that luck plays a role in that performance, his or her performance would have come up anyway, even if this guy hadn't screamed into this person's ears. But the causal story that formed in this person's mind was that it's only when I appreciate people that they kind of start to lag behind, or the appreciation gets to their mind. And therefore, I'm going to be a strict guy, and I'm going to only punish people for when they're not performing good and never appreciate them, because as soon as I appreciate, they're going to disappoint me, right? This is a real life example of how regression to the mean works. When I say that, I'm telling you how it works and also how our minds do not want to accept it, right? That is also a big fact in understanding this entire process. So, let me point out another example that I've noted down here. This is a very interesting one. You can consider, let's say, an example of a test where 50 students are given, let's say, an objective style questionnaire. 50 students, 100 questions, let's say. Objective style questions, you only have to mark true, false, and all of them are instructed to mark either true or false based purely randomly, not out of any skill or anything, just purely randomly, right? Now, at the end of the test, you would want that everyone perform average, because they were all just doing it out of luck. But we know practically that that's not how it works. And some students, by sheer luck, of course, this is all luck. So some students, let's say 10 students, out of sheer luck would get 90, would score in the top 10 percentile, right? Now, this was purely based out of luck. So if you pick those 10 students, give them the same test to um, to mark those same 100 questions, again purely out of luck, purely randomly, you're bound to see that almost all of them this time perform worse than the previous occasion, because it was all based out of luck, right? Almost for all of them, it's going to come down. The extreme outcome that they were able to achieve in the first test is bound to come down to a more mediocre level, right? Now, this is an extreme circumstance anyway. You can imagine a more real world example where a test, the outcome of a test, any questionnaire, is based both out of luck and out of skill, right? And now, if these students were given a test where they have to mark answers based out of their own thinking, and also, of course, out of luck, let's just say there's no negative marking. So, the kids who would score in the top 10 percentile, if you were to extract them out, give them another similar test, this time around, you can imagine that you're bound to see that kids who scored well in the first test would have scored both out of luck and also out of their skill. Those who scored primarily out of their luck can now be weeded out in the second retry of the similar test, right? This is how regression to the mean works again. So you can almost imagine that performance is equal to skill plus luck. Skill, you can imagine, remains almost constant, but luck, to the extent that luck played a role in the previous outcomes, luck is bound to come down or come up based on the previous occurrence, right? So just purely out of this, the student's score that was based out of luck is supposed to come down and will now be a more mediocre one, right? Now, there are even more closer to real life examples that you can see in almost your everyday life. There is something which is very commonly termed as the sports illustrated jinx. What that means is, there's a jinx going around which says that if a sports person is put on the cover of the Sports Illustrated magazine, that sports person is bound to perform poorly in the upcoming season. And people like to understand it in the form of a jinx, that because this guy was nominated by Sports Illustrated, they jinxed his performance and therefore he came down. But a more practical understanding of what actually happened with the athlete was that in the entire cesspool of so many athletes across the globe, this one person being chosen out of all of them, of course, skill would have played a part, but luck would have played a massive part too. And that luck was supposed to dry out, right? If not in the very next season, in the season after that. If not then, in the season after that. It's supposed to happen, right? And this is something which people in India who speak Hindi, of course, would definitely understand when I say this, that we like to say nazar lag gayi, right? Which is just Hindi for jinxing things, right? If you have appreciated someone, you just jinx them. तुमने उसे नजर लगा दी. And therefore, their performance, their whatever it is that they were doing, their activity, it's fallen below par now. But you have a better understanding of what is actually happening behind the scenes, right? Similarly, this can be seen in this is something which is kind of very, again, very esoteric to say, but a company having an amazing quarter, right? Their profits going right out of the charts. And if they hadn't done anything truly amazing to deserve that amazing quarter, their results are bound to come down in the next quarter. But this is something that doesn't make for kind of a very good employee or even a very good director, let's say, right? Because you're not going to be too long in the board of directors if you say that, oh, we got lucky in the previous quarter, we are just running out of luck in this one. You're not going to last very long. So you need to keep coming up with more and more stories and more things to do, so as to supplicate what happened in the previous quarter, and also come up with things to do that will kind of replicate what happened in the previous quarter, and so on and on, right? Again, this is very esoteric to say, and I know it's kind of hard to even understand. And which brings me to the point that I was bringing up in the very beginning of this episode, statisticians and mathematicians say that this concept of regression to the mean is kind of very hard for students and peers and even experienced stats people to wrap their heads around. Why do you think that's the case? I think that's primarily the case because our minds are more primed to understand stories. We like stories better. So if an athlete was performing amazingly well for, let's say, 4 or 5 years, and suddenly is not performing well, suddenly there's a slump. Or if an athlete was given the Sports Illustrated cover, he was doing so good, and suddenly he's not performing well, we would want there to be a causal story for it, right? Fame got to him. He was only after the money. He got distracted by, I don't know, the girls he was dating and whatnot. And we want these kind of causal stories. We want our company to have done well because X and Y and Z were done, not because of luck, right? Luck, we know that luck plays a part, but we give it, let's just say we give it less credit for compared to what it's actually worth. And that is why we find it very hard to wrap our heads around it. We find it very hard to wrap our heads around the fact that something that went up was supposed to come down anyway, right? I do not mean that skill does not play a part, right? And I hope I've made that point ample times in this episode already. Skill definitely plays a part, but luck plays a part too. And to the extent that luck is determining an outcome, which is quite a lot practically, it's supposed to come to a mediocre level after an extreme occurrence, right? That's all regression to the mean is, but it's hard for us to wrap our heads around it because, again, it's not a causal story. It's not a more promising story. And like I said, if you have made a day job out of creating causal stories, which is the case for a lot of us these days, it's very hard to even accept that this is a mathematical fact, right? But I hope I was able to drive home at least some examples that helped you understand what this really means, and let's talk about some examples now where it's applicable in your day to day life. I've noted down a few, which would be, let's just say, a few key takeaways from this episode. Number one is, if you have just exceeded someone's expectations, expect to disappoint them sometime soon, especially if luck played a factor in the previous appreciation, right? And luck plays a factor. Let's just agree to that. How much luck played a factor, it's of course subjective. Right? And on to my second key takeaway. If someone just recently exceeded your expectations, first of all, appreciate them because it works. Rewards work better than punishments. And secondly, if someone just exceeded your expectations, expect to be disappointed sometime soon, right? It's not only possible, it's also probable. We understand that, right? And what I'm about to say is the most important takeaway from all of this. If possible, the next time this is happening with you, the next time you click that this is what is actually happening, this person is kind of now, I am kind of now disappointed with this person because it was bound to happen. The next time this happens with you, bring all of what we just talked about into your conscious awareness and try to ask yourself, what does love look like in this moment? What does kindness look like in this moment? And then act out of it, right? I'll just leave it at that. And the third key takeaway is something that I've spoken multiple times now in this episode, but again, re-emphasizing, rewards work better than punishments. And so let's just say the next time you're around your loved ones, around people that you work with, people that you study with, whatever is your circle, reward them, appreciate them whenever they've done something which you find appreciation worthy or reward worthy, right? And also expect to be disappointed soon after. And I think that's about it. Another key takeaway from this episode, the fourth one, would be that this is really good stuff. This is really powerful stuff. And I'm not just saying this to boast. I personally feel that if more people were to understand each other in this manner, understand our social interactions, our social relationships in this manner, our entire social fabric would be very different, and different in the positive end of the spectrum, not in the broken, echo chamberly, silo kind of a manner in which our social fabric is kind of broken as of now, right? So I think this is something which is very powerful. And if you feel the same way about this kind of stuff, please do share with all of your friends, all of your community. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcast and Spotify, go on and leave us a rating there. And on Apple Podcast, of course, you can also leave us a review. We would really appreciate it because that is how eventually this content gets to reach more and more people with time. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, leave us a comment, leave us a feedback, and share this channel with as many people as you can. And I think that's about it for now. I'll see you in the next episode. Until next time, peace out.